called Hunter's Boarding House, and every Sunday they had a roast chicken dinner. You know, you had traveling men, salesmen, coming down that road, and they'd stay in Espanola for the night or for the weekend. Now, there's an interesting thing here, and I don't want to hammer too much on the African American experience, but you know, there was slavery. It existed. We know it did. One of the big industries here was turpentine, and many of the families that were freed after the Revolution or after the Civil War stayed right here. They never left, and they worked in the turpentine industry. And there were turpentine camps such as Neoga, which was completely African American. But here in Espanola, African Americans could buy land. Guess what? Because they were forbidden to buy land, former slaves in Florida, but they could buy land here. And they did buy land here. And there's a big settlement here with some of the first one-room schoolhouses in Flagler County. And there are some buildings here built by former slaves using local materials such as stucco. And they're right here. They very much exist. Let's see if we can find one maybe. We go down Railroad Street. This is where the railroad station was, the narrow gauge railroad. And we're going to go down to the right here, and you're going to see some brown stucco buildings. These are post-Civil War buildings built by families that were slaves. And they're right here. There they are. Right there, you're looking at one. There it is. That building's way over 160 years old. And there's the one-room schoolhouse right there, St. Paul Youth Center. That was an African-American one-room schoolhouse. And this is Reverend Giddings Church, and this is the site of the Masonic Lodge, the Masonic Cemetery. But this was an African-American community, and these were former slaves right here that bought land in Espanola. And there's a large community out here too. And no one knows it. Okay, you kind of wonder what became of all these people. Where'd they go? Okay, we're coming up on the Espanola Cemetery, and it's one of the oldest cemeteries in Flagler County, and most of your early pioneer families are buried here. But it was an old ancient Indian site. It's high ground. In other words, it's sort of a ridge. And Cisco Dean told me that whenever they dig a grave in this cemetery, they almost always find ancient Indian artifacts. In other words, this was a site not only for a cemetery today of the early pioneers, but it was also an ancient Indian town, perhaps thousands of years old, because it was high ground. It's called the Espanola Cemetery. If you're into cemeteries, I'm not into cemeteries. I'm not a cemetery fan, but this is an interesting one right here. And you can wander through, see the old graves, see the Moody's, and Stricklands, and Cowards, and all these old early families. They're buried there. And that's where many of the people from Espanola ended up in that cemetery. Now, Flagler's kind of interesting agricultural because there were many industries here. We talked about lumber. It was a big deal in the colonial period. We also had turpentine. Turpentine was the magic elixir. They called it naval stores. and they were used to repair and maintain the wooden sailing ships. Remember that in Europe, they'd cut down most of their trees, and to build these wooden ships, they were hard-pressed for lumber. So Florida was a great exporter of shipbuilding lumber, naval stores, which would be turpentine, rosin, paint, all sorts of early liquids used in the building of ships. And this was a major industry here. The last turpentine mill shut down around 1950 when they found alternative materials than turpentine. Now, another great industry here, of course, was farming. And they raised potatoes, they raised cabbages. One advantage is that the Flagler farmers had about a 3-month jump on the market. You're going to see right now, it's almost December, and they're planting the fields out here like mad. There's plantings going in all over the place out here, and you'll see them laying in crops of cabbages, all sorts of crops being planted right now as we speak. And they're trying to get a jump on the market. Now, one thing I was told, and this is fascinating, they've sort of dumping their cabbages for bok choy. Bok choy is a Chinese cabbage, and apparently they could get more money for bok choy than they can for regular cabbage. So they over the years, they've shifted their crops. Once upon a time, they grew grass out here because of all the new housing developments. The cabbage fields became grass fields where they grew grass for lawns. But I think that's pretty much starting to die out. And now they're starting to put in produce. But you see grass being harvested right here. So grass growing was another industry. But sometimes these fields are that were growing grass were growing cabbages. They have a plant out here that looks exactly like corn. And you come out here thinking you're seeing fields of corn, and it's sorghum. Sorghum is sometimes ground up because it makes excellent fertilizer for the land. It also makes a very good cattle feed. The cows love sorghum. So you'll see stuff growing sometimes, looks exactly like corn, but it's sorghum. You have to really be in an airplane to see Flagler County, but there is a rich, rich farm area of Flagler County, and a lot of money has been made here. Once upon a time, this was all migrant labor, and when this first tour was run by Jim Allen, he used to drive the migrants around, but today machinery has taken their place. We have very few migrant laborers here now, but a lot of machinery. Now these are all new plantings. See, they've just recently planted it. These fields will be rich with crops, I'm going to say January, February. There'll be stuff spouting all over the place. This is a really nice drive to make after Christmas, January, February. You can see they're plowing the fields, they're getting them ready for crops, and there's literally frantic activity out here in the January, February, March period. That's Dr. Kanakris' house. He was the man that built the first hospital in Flagler County in Bunnell. It's falling apart. It's held up in some big dispute among relatives. Okay, now we're going to turn on 305, and I say sadly, it's being paved, so we're going to have an adventure here if we get down it at all. I don't know, driver, can we go down 305? Is it dead?
I don't have a clue.
I don't have a clue. I don't know if we can get down it.
I don't either.
We may have to go to the next road, which is available, and we can get there on the next road.
Yeah, we know what that road's all.
Yeah, we know that one. I don't think we're going to make 305. I recommend we go on.
Yeah.
we're going to miss the fireworks place, and we're going to miss some of the farming. I'm sorry, I apologize for that. But they're paving this road, and I'm not sure we'll even get down it. I just don't see that we will.
Wait.
I don't know.
Looks like they're gonna.
There's nobody giving directions, are there?
He's waving his hand.
Yeah.
No, he might be scratching his nose.
Well, we'll say it's a way for traffic to go.
Oh Lord, protect us, for we know not what we do.
Okay.
They are paving this road for sure.
Thank God.
Anyway, this is Flagler farming, and there's a lot of it. And I had an experienced farmer on this bus tour, and I said, well, how do you survive? I mean, how do you keep from burning out the land? And he said, we rotate our crops. In other words, one year a field will have sorghum in it. Next year it might be fallow. Following year it might be do something else. So he said it was for extremely good management. They've kept this land fertile for hundreds of years, and they grow tremendous amounts of stuff come out of Flagler County. The recent fires and bad weather in California have helped the Florida farmers immeasurably and provided more of a market for their materials. But basically in history, the Florida potato, or the Flagler potato, I'm going to call it, is eminently suitable for making potato chips. And I was told that Lay's would come in and contract for the entire crop. In other words, they'd write contracts for the entire potato crop to be made into potato chips. I don't know if that's still true, but they built a big distribution center out here, an immense distribution center with semi-trucks to haul the Flagler potatoes to market, and cabbages. We also found a watermelon. Oh, is upcoming a drive-through liquor. Right there, you can get your pickup truck loaded with cases of beer. It's the only drive-through liquor store I've ever known. We just went by it, and you're in rustic Flagler, I'll tell you. But this is not poor farmers. These are not poor, hard-scrabble dirt farmers. These are very successful commercial farms. So you might say that some of those people back in 1914, 1918 that came down here, bought their 40-acre farm, got very, very rich. They made a lot of money. And you can see machinery. They use a lot of machinery on these farms.